Well, today I'd like to welcome Ruth and Jerry Cohen, who are part of Evolving Elders, as my guest today. And so the first question I usually ask is, what generation are you in, Ruth and Jerry?
Okay, so we are the baby boom generation.
Mission?
But when you think about that, the baby boom generation spans 18 years. And
Right,
so the differences between people born in 1946 and people born in 1964 are pretty significant.
I'll just build on that. I often ask folks, how many of you were born when Franklin Roosevelt was president? And remember that. How many were you born and remember when President Kennedy was assassinated? And it's eerie when maybe two people raise their hand in the room if I'm doing a workshop for a university now. The reality is that my experience as a kid who was born in 1952 is very different than someone born, let's say, 1960 or 61. Back to memory and those
right,
cohorts and things that we kind of hold together. So the caveat with baby boomer is, boy, that's a big boom.
right, right. So the differences that you see in the 18-year span, what are maybe some of the differences you see with people born in the 1960s versus the ones born in 19, was it 47, I believe? Uh, so what are some of the
Some of the research
changes?
yeah, some of the research I've seen is that, and again, not to stereotype, but back to kind of experientially in terms of politics, as an example, those born
Mhm.
perhaps from 46 to maybe 1958 tend to be more on the or labeled liberal progressive side when it comes to both policy and economics. Whereas those that are born afterwards, I always thought of Alex Keaton. Was it
Family ties.
Family Ties?
Family
There
ties.
is a shift, and part of it is again, coming of age at a time when suddenly now we've gone through Watergate and other things. So a lot of it is back to key timing things that happen in terms of age cohorts, and I think that's a major difference
Right.
right there.
Yeah. Well, I did a series on generations. So I talked to boomers, I've talked to the uh, X generation, the millennials, and a Z. And it's been kind of interesting to see how the span of those individuals, their thoughts and things that are happening, but they're totally different. And I appreciate that fact. And I think now we'll see a little more, hopefully, individuals being aware of older individuals and evolving elders. What is your personal philosophy on aging? Do you have one?
Well, for mine, it starts with purpose. Viktor Frankl,
Okay.
with as a human, we all need purpose, and a key component in my mind of purpose is engagement, social engagement, other ways of engagement. But being engaged on something purposeful makes a world of difference as we age, and is the most successful social determinant or social determinant of what makes for successful aging.
And
I
what about you,
like
Ruth?
a quote that Susan Sokol Blosser came up with that we heard recently, and that is, do not regret growing older. It is an honor that is denied to many.
Right.
And when you think about the horrible, unfortunate tragedies that are unfolding, there are generations of people who will never have the honor of growing older. So I agree. I mean, Jerry and I wouldn't be doing Evolving Elders if we didn't have an agreement on finding meaning and purpose as life goes on. But it's also to remember that we are honored to be at the age that we are.
Right. And I think that one of the things that I found very impressive about Evolving Elders was some of your workshops that you did specifically on, um, you know, the trying to find your your purpose, maybe your passion. So could you talk a little bit about those type of things and what you discuss in those seminars and workshops?
So I think our flagship workshop that we've developed is called Standing at the Crossroads. And we
Yes.
initially developed it for kind of in parallel to our own lives, at a time when Jerry was getting ready to, quote, retire. I've been self-employed for so long that I've I've worked and retired and worked and retired. I keep reinventing myself. But the point being that when people are stepping out of something that's incredibly familiar, sometimes they're not quite sure which way to go or what to do. They maybe have never had an opportunity to develop some of their outside interests. So we had initially focused it on people who were getting ready to leave their career job, or people that had
Hmm.
just recently left and were kind of floundering. But what we're working on now is developing that for people who are in their 40s or a little bit younger. These are the people now that have, they're well established in their careers
Right.
and kind of are stuck with. A number of the people that we've talked to have said, I've been working long enough, I've moved my way up the ranks, I've gone about as far as I can go. I'm getting a little bored, but I'm so secure financially and with insurance and everything else. I don't know that I can leave.
Right.
And so we're working on developing it more for people who are also at that point in their careers of what's next. I know that there's a bigger world, and so, but I'm not quite sure how to go out there and get it.
Right. And so it's going back to Jerry's comment about finding purpose, and you can find purpose at any age. And so I really appreciate you taking that message to younger individuals. That's great. So part of that crossroads, when you talk to them about how they find purpose, how is that kind of explained to those individuals within the workshop?
How do we explain how they
Well,
find purpose?
part of it is starting with self-reflection and looking back on
Okay.
what gave you meaning, or in the case of dealing with transition and change,
Right.
going back as to, well, what worked and frankly what didn't work, and not to beat yourself up, but rather to flag, this approach that I took, I really suffered for a while because of it, and so, but obviously somehow I came through. So it's reflecting
Right.
back, building on that, and we have some exercises we have tested out and found are useful then in starting to reflect forward as to, let me play with and do some brainstorming of what are some things that I could be doing. I think the most important thing that we emphasize is that, well, two things. One size does not fit all. There's no cookie cutter
Right.
answer to what I do next. Most importantly, you can change gears, you can change and shift gears and change direction. So I know that as I stepped away from my career job, that I went into doing several things after taking some respite, some time off for me,
Mhm.
that looked at, oh, maybe I'd like to try this. And you know what? It didn't seem to bring me to joy or purpose. Therefore, I'm going to try something else. So it's coming up with a
Right.
menu, plan A, plan B, plan C, and that's okay.
Yeah.
And I think it's
What
also
about
being open
So,
to opportunities, as Jerry was
right?
saying, that I know for myself, not when someone asks me to be involved in something, not immediately saying yes, not immediately saying no, doing some research, talking to people who may already also be involved in it, and finding out whether it's something that I personally want to be involved in, or is
Hmm.
it something I believe in this organization and the work that they're doing, but I don't want to support it with my time, so how else could I find a way to support it? whether it's you know making a donation or something like that.
Sure. Is there any studies or any data on if a person's transition is planned for retirement versus one that is it's brought on by the company or by the firm? Is that handled different in the transition process? Do you think?
Having worked for AARP a number of years, I know indeed that to the extent that you can plan ahead, and in their various aspects to planning, it's kind of Maslow's hierarchy of need. Yes, I look at financial planning and where I would be and can I afford, what do I need to do to get to attain that level of security? What about my health and how am I going to care for myself? And then build on to, of course, the key elements of purpose, et cetera. So all that requires some planning ahead and not to be afraid of reaching out for help, getting the
Right.
resources. And that's part of what we do in Evolving Elders is I do a workshop that gets to advanced planning, and whether it's
Right.
career change or whether it's retirement, um, doesn't matter. It's what are the elements of what you have to anticipate best you can anticipate. And
There are so many times when um, people don't have any control.
Right.
That and that to me is one of the big differences is whether you're planning to leave that employer or whether the employer decides that you're leaving.
Right.
So the pre-planning that Jerry was just talking about actually is good in both situations. One
Hmm.
that okay, I plan to leave my position in 6 months, and here's what I need to do to get ready for that. And then the other side is just doing the pre planning in general because you never know when life can throw you a major curveball in terms of where you have to make a change suddenly.
Now, as part of the transition process, if I know a lot of people where the career is themselves, it's the essence of themselves. So, how does one approach when that is the situation on trying to figure out what your purpose in transition is, since that had been your entire life?
So, when I came up with the concept of evolving elders back in 2018, I was walking along Agate Beach and just thinking deep ocean thoughts. And what came to me was the line of who are you now that you're not what you were? Because our
Ah, that's great.
society defines so much a person's identity and worth based on the job that they do. How many times have we all walked into social situations and you maybe don't know anybody and the question that comes up pretty immediately is, well, what do you do?
Right.
Well, it's it so that's how we tend to in our western culture define people. And so
Right.
a lot of the work that we do in helping people continue to find meaning and purpose in life is helping them step out of that idea that they're only who they are based on their job,
Right.
that we're all much more um, whole than that. There's so much more to
Right.
us than just our job.
and in doing that, Gary, often some of the exercises we do really revolves around what brings you joy or what has brought you joy, and also the flip side of what do you aspire to be, what do you aspire to
Hmm.
do, and that takes more pondering. But often again, it's
Absolutely.
built off a reflection.
Right. And I liked Ruth's comment about reinventing oneself as you come through this process. But that brings to mind Madonna, who's in her 60s. And I look back at her career and she's reinvented herself several times. So it's possible to do that. So I appreciate that. What do you think successful aging looks like in the US today?
So, in my professional career, I was a longtime geriatric care manager. So, I
Right.
met elders in a wide variety of situations over the years. And I could have two people who, when you look at them, pretty similar circumstances. They both may have physical challenges, their socioeconomic status may be the same, their living situations may be the same. And one person greets the world every day with joy and
Hmm.
gratitude, and the other one doesn't,
Right.
which caused me years ago to start reflecting on what's the difference and how are people, um, what makes for if that this is edited, um, for people who are challenging. We're all challenged somehow, and so what gets people through it and still engaged in life, and why do some people give up?
I,
Right.
Thank you.
and I'll just add that I've done a lot of international travel, which has given me broader perspectives of
Hmm.
cultures and aging. I have a problem sometimes saying successful aging per se, that word successful, because I don't know, that's subjective. But I
Right.
do think that back to purpose, meaning legacy, that there's something intrinsic in value. And that means that I'm looking at the glass half full and not half empty. Now that's
Right.
hard. There are persons wired that are, I mean, by nature sad,
Right.
cynical, etc. But I think that to embrace the longevity bonus that we're given as we age, compared to our parents and grandparents, means that there's something more that we can embrace of being of value and noting I still, in some little way, can meaningfully contribute to the world. It may be because of my physical and cognitive limitations. It's just interacting with one other person and making
Right.
their day better. That may be good enough.
Right. I like the term legacy, and I hadn't really thought it in that context, Jerry. So, can you expand on that a little bit? What do you mean by legacy?
Well, I first of all, I like to steal from our friend Jay Bloom, who talks
Yes,
about
Jay.
returnment rather than
Then
retirement. Um,
exactly,
and it's part of it.
exactly.
But to me, legacy is leaving the world a little better off, individuals a little better off in some manner than what I left it.
Right.
And that's touching the soul of another person. And I know you,
Right.
particularly reading your five persons.
Oh, yeah, there's a lot of good books that talk about, um, what we leave ourselves, but also what we gain by giving to others,
Right.
um, and not necessarily in identifiable, tangible ways. I think the best example I can give from certainly from the past couple of years. So I was one of those people that masked up and went to the grocery store. I didn't want somebody else picking out my groceries. I wanted to go to the
Right.
grocery store. And so I would mask up, I would glove up in the early days. And when I went through the checkout line, I made a conscious effort to greet that checker eyeball to eyeball, face
Right.
to face, and acknowledge that they were there for my benefit.
Right.
And I can't tell you the number of times where they would look at me back and say thank you,
Right.
because just acknowledging someone as a human being and not just as a robot there, scanning your groceries or
Right.
whatever. It means a lot. That's a legacy. To me, it's kind of the butterfly effect. So
Hmm.
if I'm nice to a person, maybe the ripple effect is they're going to be nice to somebody who's going to be nice to somebody. And that to me is how each of us can have a positive impact.
Absolutely. And I think that's a great illustration of having an impact, even a small one that we can all do with individuals. Jay Bloom was my first guest on the podcast. And so um, it was great to interact with him and his knowledge and wisdom. So I'm plugging the first episode for our listeners out there that know Jay. So you Jerry, you said you travel around the world and you've seen some different models of aging, I guess is the right term for that. So, what are some of the positive things out of those models that you've seen in other countries that we might want to look at in the US?
Well, a couple of places that I've been where I'm just in awe of, first of all, the veneration and respect
Hmm.
that younger generations give to older generations and engagement. Related to that is that it's very intergenerational. There's no
Hmm.
segregation. If anything, it's multi generational engagement, support of each other. So, two places in particular in Vietnam, I still recall getting up early in the morning, and there was a park across from the bed and breakfast I stayed at. And there were all different generations doing various exercises. You name it, from Tai Chi to the machines that you have in parks now for fitness,
Hmm.
and they were all interacting together in Turkey, where we were at, again, it seemed like the old men were playing backgammon in a corner, but all the kids were gathered around and they were all learning and they were explaining, the older persons were explaining how the game was played. So those are the sorts of things that I think, irrespective of the physical plant, and we think of nursing home care and all that. It's that level of care and respect that I think makes truly a cultural difference in terms of both legacy and in purpose.
Right. I attended a conference in the Netherlands and I saw a very dramatic difference between the US and how they treat their elders. And I think the intergenerational is very important as well. But one of the things I noticed is they strive to have healthcare and care come into the home and it's paid for out of a tax by the government. And so the person stays in their home and you have people that get insurance and benefits and all that taking care of it. It was a very pointed moment for me to see that, and it worked well. The other thing I think I realized is they use innovation in equipment. So this has been 15 years ago. On a wheelchair, they had it where you would use your hands like this instead of doing the wheel thing. I have yet to see one of those in the US, but I think it's a great idea. I loved it. So I think you're absolutely correct that other generations, intergenerational is a key maybe in other countries for that.
I, I will add on the wheelchair issue. You have, I still volunteer with AARP, and we do a
Uh-huh.
program called Neighbor Walks that does various neighborhoods. The volunteers organize it. The one we just did a week and a half ago in Tigard, there was a gentleman with a walker that had arm holders that was just perfect. He said, I can lean forward. And,
Right.
I asked, where'd you get it? He said, I got it at Costco. So, we're slowly getting there in terms of
Yeah,
figuring out the type of technology that gives dignity to an individual,
sure.
independence, and allows for the engagement.
Yeah, absolutely.
Anyway,
And I think one of the things that you guys maybe in involving elders is the independence part of that. So is that part of evolving elders, and how does that play out for individuals?
Well, I think in both of our careers, Jerry from the policy and advocacy
Right.
perspective, and me from the more direct clinical work, I think both of us individually respecting the dignity of the person has been that's like pretty much the cornerstone of both of our interactions with elders and families, because that's how I want to be treated.
Right. Right.
there is one flip side that I would emphasize prior to my working in aging, or it is an interregnum, I guess, in between careers, was a career working in the field of developmental disabilities and physical disabilities
Yeah.
in a university setting. And the phrase that was used, and I believe we as elders need to grab onto as well, is interdependence. It
Hmm.
means that I'm not afraid of and being willing to accept the help of others, knowing my limitations.
Right.
So that's the flip side of not only being fiercely independent, but fiercely interdependent, and knowing that there are some things that for for good purposes to allow me to continue to engage, I will need help on, and be
Right.
willing to accept that with humility and recognition that that's helping another person on their purpose.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I'll give a little example. My 92-year-old mother uh, wanted her mattress changed the other day. So she's in there trying to do it with me. And I went, no, no, you need to just let me do this. And so that's it. But boy, that independent streak came through and she said, I can do this. And I said,
Yeah.
well, you might, but I'm going to do it for you. So I think that's pretty cool on the independent spirit. But again, the interdependency is a very, very important. Uh, and do you think the older baby boomers might have a little more problem with asking for help versus maybe another generation?
Well, I certainly can speak of those that before the baby boom, certainly in terms of our parents,
Yeah,
that proud streak, and also the sense, and I think it carries through with boomers too. Not only is it fiercely independent, but also I don't want to be a burden.
right.
And so that's the other part of it, I think, is that we tend to discount help because we feel that we're becoming a burden on others. And that's frowned upon in our society as well. It's like
Yeah,
nobody wants to be a burden.
absolutely. Absolutely. So, uh, you Evolving Elders works with individuals and families, and you do assessments and make recommendations. So, explain to me a little bit about what the assessment would look like, because I know it covers several different aspects and the person. So, how does that look like? What does an assessment look like?
So this stems from my 40 plus years of working as a geriatric care manager.
Right.
And families and elders sometimes are just stuck
Hmm.
in that they know that some changes need to happen, but they're not quite sure what supports are out there, what's really needed, how do they go about getting it, how is it going to be paid for. And it can range anywhere from, the elders saying, I really want to stay in my home, okay, but maybe physical limitations if the person's in an older Portland home with steep staircase and there's mobility issues. So maybe we can't redesign the house. We can't move a bedroom to the first floor, or maybe there isn't even a bathroom on the first floor.
Right.
So sometimes it's just helping to identify what the concerns are and then coming up with a plan of how to make all that happen. Um, Attorneys, financial planners are also, as professionals, oftentimes asked to come up with those solutions. And so it's not unusual that I will get a call from from another professional saying, "This is Ruth. This is more your bailiwick. Can you come talk to this family?"
Right.
the The assessments include things like looking at. I kind of what I do is I put the elder in the middle, okay, and then what are all the supports that are available? Family, friends, medical, spiritual, financial, and how do we make the concerns, the challenges that the elder is faced with, how can we utilize all of the support systems to come up with a plan to support that person?
Right. And
And sometimes the person can stay at home and sometimes they have to relocate.
right. And how do you get the person to buy into the assessment and the plan?
How do you get the family or the
The
elder?
elder. How do you get the elder to buy into the plan? Some tips on that?
um,
Relationship.
it's relationship building.
Uh-huh.
Um, it also depends on how someone like me is introduced.
Right.
Is it, um, you shall talk to this person,
Uh-huh.
you shall talk to Ruth Cohen, or, huh, you know, Mom, we've been talking about these things for a while. And I now know, I know of someone who can come in and help us sort through it all.
Right.
So um, I can pretty much guarantee that having it as a dogmatic,
Mm-hmm.
um, it's going to happen, that often creates some
Right.
barriers to my conversation.
Absolutely. In my past experience, Ruth, working with geriatric case managers and those is they have a good sense of knowing how to navigate those discussions if given the right format to do that. But also they're a neutral third party. And usually the elder will listen more to a third party than they will the family members. Do you find that to be correct as well?
It's not unusual, but usually because there's so much emotional stuff
Right.
that happens between parents and children. The parent remembers when this child was born.
Right.
And so, and then you get into sibling um,
Dynamics.
dynamics.
Right.
You
Right.
wanted to say something?
Oh, yeah. Of course, Ruth is the reality based, on the ground type of assessment.
Right.
I'm Mr. kind of macro public policy, but one project I've been involved in years as an attorney, and I have to be careful because I'm not licensed in Oregon. I don't practice law in Oregon. But what I've done is for groups for the most part, but also individuals, kind of review, are you aware of these various planning tools,
Right.
many of which are here resources that are available for you, including care management?
Mm-hmm.
Have you looked at all these things? Have you had a discussion to start these things, particularly when it comes to a healthcare representative of advanced
Mm-hmm.
directives? So those are all things that we try to cover back to pre-planning, but in the midst of crisis, boy, then it's very difficult. Then it's like, well, maybe I cannot even do an advanced directive because the elder is just not, lacks capacity,
Right.
incompetent
Right.
in other ways.
And I tend to find that people get into more crises than they do pre-planning. So you're usually brought in after the fact. But I think it's really good to have an assessment tool to know where the baseline is for individuals and
Mhm.
how to work with them. Um, so the process can be very overwhelming, I'm sure, for the elder as well as the family. So, how do you approach a discussion with a family member about after the assessment, Ruth, when outlining they are, what needs to your plan for how things need to work or change or that sort of thing? So, how do you bring that, talk to them about the report and the assessment?
Well, my own style,
Mm-hmm.
I guess, or my own process. The first meeting of the elder and the family typically is only about an hour and a half,
Okay.
because after an hour and a half, people get
Yeah,
tired.
absolutely.
And so, gathering what information I can during that, typically it's enough that I can come up with a plan of recommendations and suggestions, pros and cons, the challenges and the
Right.
opportunities. And so sometimes I have to have a second interview before I can get to that point.
Mm-hmm.
But once I get to that point, um, in the recommendation section is typically resources. The family and I may have had the discussion about the family wants to be fully involved, but who's going to do what?
Right.
Particularly in those situations where there's a family member who lives close by to the elder and another sibling lives at a distance. How can that person still be actively engaged? And then we have a wealth of community resources here in the Portland metropolitan area, certainly. And then what the internet can be a positive resource, not always,
Right.
but helping guide, giving those resources that I have found to be very reputable
Right.
in terms of gathering information. So it again, it's not a cookie cutter. Every assessment I have done, every recommendation report is different.
Right.
because the elder and the families are all individuals
It's exactly the
and
same with
circumstances are
my
different.
clients. Is there's no cookie cutter. It is a case by case basis. Something might have worked that you've done with another case or another client, but necessarily won't work in this situation unless it's tweaked a little bit. So I think that's very important to understand. um, I tend to have a challenge with discharge planners in hospitals, trying to get them to tweak these things around in order to make them work. So I think that having a geriatric case manager yourself is probably the key to being successful in these outcomes with elders.
Well, in fairness, yeah, in fairness to discharge planners, they don't have the same
Right,
opportunities. They don't get to see the person's living
right,
situation. They don't get the opportunity to look at who else is involved.
right.
So they, um, I do not want their jobs.
No,
They really work very hard.
they do, and to doing that one, and in the current hospital environment, it's very challenging because they're wanting them discharged immediately, and trying to find the right placement might be an issue for everybody. So that's very true. So I just want to mention geriatric care manager is a higher skill level. You have training and those type of things, and I've been familiar with their organization and association for a long time. But would you explain a little bit about how a geriatric care manager might be able to provide additional skills that another social worker or another case manager would provide?
Let me be sure I understand your question. How do geriatric care managers, how are we
Right, and what's
differentiated from other?
case
Okay.
managers?
Um, well, for one, I mean, part of one of the biggest things is for a person like myself, I've been in private
Right.
practice. So I'm a private individual, fully licensed, fully certified in whatever I
Hmm.
was, um, which means that I'm private
Hmm.
pay. People have to pay me a
Right.
fee. There are other agencies, for example, the Area Agency on
Right.
Aging has case management services, but their clientele tends to fall with different
Right.
criteria. And they unfortunately do not have unlimited funds, so they cannot serve everybody. They have to serve those with greatest need.
Right.
And their caseloads are much
Right.
higher. Hospitals, discharge planners, maybe social workers, maybe nurses. Very often they're nurses. And they are responsible for arranging for
Hmm.
aftercare when a person leaves. And then there's um, home health agencies that have case managers. I know attorneys who have paralegals that call them case managers. So it's a term that can be used somewhat generically, and it's one of those terms that it can be hard for the consumer to come up with a good. That apples don't always equal apples.
All I was going to add is, and something that when I worked for ARP, I know that a number of our state offices advocated for was some level of particularly in the field of private care management, those that put out a shingle, that there's some certification
Right.
process, there's some quality assurance process put into place. Because, sadly, I may have cared for my mother, and now I say, I know how to do this, and I put out a
Right.
shingle. And in many states, in places, you can do that without any problem at all, and any scrutiny at all, and any accountability. And that to me is the key.
Right.
So
I
And I have to say that the certification for care managers in private sector happens at the
right.
national level. There's a national certification process. It does, the states do not
Right.
certify. So I'm licensed as a social worker in Oregon, but I have no certification as a care
Right.
manager because it's done at the national
And I
level.
think my experience with a geriatric care manager is you have a better level of experience and a better level at identifying issues and solutions because you know the process and you've been certified on a national level. So there is some basis of the knowledge level that you will have. So when I hire a geriatric care manager in Portland, if I need one in Texas, you guys are going to have basically the same knowledge across the board. And I think that's what's really important, especially for children living out of state and mom or dad might be living here. I think the solution of having someone that would come in, do the assessments, would help walk me through the process, and then have a solution living out of state. How do we keep track of mom and dad here because they don't want to move? And I think that's the key that I find across with the geriatric care managers. And I've done that a couple of times where I've had clients in different areas or moving to children. We've used the geriatric care manager in those roles. So I think that's important. So one of the things that I really liked was all the workshops and seminars that you guys have done. And so we talked about the transition one, and I think I said to you in my little email to you that sign me up. I'm ready to take that one. So what are some of the other ones that,
You're on the
oh,
list,
good,
Jerry.
good, good. I'm so excited about that. But I think part of the other ones that I saw was how do, your passion and purpose is one of them, standing at the crossroads. And then you had some geared strictly for women, Ruth. So can you talk a little bit about how those became about and what is the mission of those workshops?
Um, so I actually started doing workshops probably, well, I always have to count backwards and minus the last 2 years. So about 5 years ago, I actually started doing workshops specifically for women. And the precursor to standing at the crossroads was one of them. I forget now what I called it. Maybe I did call it that. Anyway, I came back and was telling Jerry about how it works, and he goes, "Well, aren't you ever going to do it for men?" So I said,
Yes.
"Okay," um, but working with women, particularly women who are, just to define, maybe over the age of 50, is it all encompasses everything that we've talked about. It's about how do you continue to find, how do you remain
Right.
relevant, and how do you embrace the idea of being an older woman, um, and the power and the wisdom, and how can you find ways to use that um, in previous old times. Older women were known as crones, and I always have to spell it Crones because I have to train my computer that it does not mean Crohn's disease. But crones were the wise old women. They um, they had a lot of
Right.
power, and ultimately they were the ones that were also burned for
Right.
being witches. But crones were the wise women, and it's helping women understand that as they get older, they still have an incredible amount of gifts
Right.
to give in terms of wisdom and support to others. So that's the workshops. We're more focused on that, and that was kind of where I got started, and then we moved it into
Yeah.
elders as a whole.
And one other aspect that we did do when it came to caregiving
Mm-hmm.
was that more often than not, although the data shows that more and more men are becoming caregivers, not just caretaker or
Recipients.
Yeah.
caregivees, I guess you would call it. But that is that again, women have sacrificed a lot in terms of the
Mm-hmm.
workplace, and we're seeing with the pandemic across ages, more often than not, women are having to be at home for the kids, can't get back to work, and then maybe caregiving now for mom and dad or grandpa and
Right.
grandpa. So, again, that other aspect, we've kind of morphed or evolved it into a broader array. But we do workshops on caregiving and resilience and caring for yourself. And that, I have to confess, are usually 90% or
Right.
more women
Right.
that attend.
Well, that's an interesting observation and one that I think is very important. And Ruth, I think it's great that you're doing the workshops on women and showing how they can become wiser in age and give that knowledge away to others. Appreciate that. So the other thing, is there any future workshops out there coming up that you guys are going to be doing?
Well, we're Jerry and I recently engaged in a rather broad brainstorming session between ourselves about where we
Uh,
want to go with this and what kinds of workshops. We don't have any immediately
right,
scheduled, but we're hoping, if not later this fall, then certainly after the first of the year. It takes a while to
right.
develop these
And test them.
and beta test them,
And so,
frankly.
so what's beta testing?
Yeah, I'm sorry. The two areas that we've done a little bit, and I think again over the course of this year and going into next year, one is back to how okay I'm planning ahead and everything, but particularly when it comes to planning ahead and caregiving, how do I start the
Hmm.
conversation and follow through? And sometimes we're really talking about multiple conversations. So some tips and ways to go about that that are more helpful. The other, of course, is something that because of a state project that I serve on, but I've been adapting for different audiences, is just understanding the tools to move forward on
Right,
planning ahead. And that's the broader issue that includes financial planning. What is a trust officer? Knowing these various, the terminology, and try to demystify the process as far as
right.
navigating for due diligence as a good, smart consumer. That's part of what I've covered in some of the workshops I've done, starting with my congregation. So, I'm kind of practicing with the beta testing with some set audiences, and then go, okay, what do I want to tweak?
Having the conversation,
Yeah.
having the conversation between parents and adult children about um, what the elder may want in the way of services and care as they get older. Jerry and I have worked individually and collectively with elders for 40
Right.
plus years. We think everybody should know this and everybody should have the conversations. However, we've had our own personal experiences of family members and parents who have been a bit resistant to having the conversation. So we've had that
Yeah.
side of it too. Um, so we we're working on how best to um, to develop those workshops that are um, relevant and can be of the most have the most impact.
And one other thing, I've had a dear friend who is a business leader has said, start to think about segmentation in the sense of here are things to do when you're in your 20s and 30s. And then here are things that you really should be already have started to do, maybe in your 40s to around retirement, close to whatever the retirement word means these days. And even after whatever is like in my what's next now, having stepped away from a solid career paid type of position that I've had, still, how do I continue to look at and adapt, particularly right now, looking at
Hmm.
the markets?
Yeah.
Hmm, what do I need to be aware of to change and to leave alone when it comes to my
Right.
current investments,
Right.
as an example? So all those are more segmented based on more of an age type of factor that you
And
want
I
to
think,
use.
Jerry, I really appreciate your friend putting the segment part in there because it's something I hadn't thought about, but it certainly makes sense after you've explained that to us. The question I had is beta testing, and you alluded to it, is having presenting to a group and then having them give you feedback. Is that correct on beta testing? Yeah.
Mm,
Yeah.
yes.
So
Absolutely.
um, that's a great idea. I don't think I've heard anybody else mention beta testing to do that. So that's great that you guys do that. So is there any other type of thing or anything else you'd like to share with our audience?
Well, again, I go back to what we started with, which is um, meaningful purpose and engagement. Um, I will say that to me, that ties into your question earlier about legacy. But I also think about in the here and now when I'm dealing in a time of change and
Right.
anxiety. The word resilience we actually have used beyond resilience in caregiving, and that is in any type of transition from A to what may become B, but I'm not there yet, and maybe it doesn't get to B, it goes over to C instead, is how do I care for
Right.
myself? What are some of the tools and strategies that can help me while I'm in the wilderness? And so that's something we do as well. And I realized we hadn't plugged it, but it's something that we started to do as the pandemic started, and we've just gotten back to
And
as well.
thank you for sharing that, Jerry. I think that's a future workshop for you guys on that. So, Ruth, do you have anything you would like to share?
We um, so Jerry was just talking about resilience, and certainly a lot of the work that we share and the information that we share with other people, a lot of it's
Hmm.
based on ourselves, what we've gone through, what we've experienced, the number of people in our lives that we've watched and we've been part of their lives. And we've either been recipients of their knowledge and wisdom or we've been able to share ours with them. So it's not like that we're the magic gurus of all of this. We're
Right.
just two people who this is our purpose now as we have reached this point in our lives is to open conversations, to share what we know, and to learn from
Absolutely.
each other.
Well, I would like to thank you, both Jerry and Ruth, for being guests on my podcast. Truly amazing conversation, and thank you so much.
Well, thank you,
Well,
Gary.
thank you, Gary, and I'm looking for that glass of bourbon over there and enjoy it. Thanks.